The clay tablet rests in a climate-controlled vault beneath the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Its catalogue number reads CBS 10673. The fragment measures roughly 6 inches across, its surface covered in the wedge-shaped impressions scholars call cuneiform. When you hold a cast of this tablet, the original too fragile for regular handling, you feel the weight of fired clay, the slight roughness where the ancient scribe's reed stylus pressed too hard, the smoothness where thousands of years have worn the edges soft. This particular tablet came from Nippur, one of ancient Sumer's most sacred cities, excavated in the 1890s from the ruins of what had been a temple library. The text inscribed upon it dates to approximately 1600 BCE, though the story it preserves reaches back further still into the deepest layers of Mesopotamian memory. Scholars call it the Eridu Genesis, or sometimes simply the Nippur Flood Tablet. The surviving portion describes the creation of humanity, lists the cities that existed before a catastrophic deluge, names their rulers, and recounts the flood itself. But here's what makes a person pause when reading the translation. The text doesn't speak of creation the way most ancient myths do. There's no poetry about cosmic eggs or primordial battles giving birth to consciousness. Instead, there are instructions. Procedures. A method for bringing forth thinking beings from materials that already existed. The language possesses a strange precision, as if the scribe were documenting a process that someone, somewhere, had actually performed. The gods created humans, the tablet states. They fashioned them from clay. But not just any clay. Clay mixed with something else. Other texts from this same tradition specify what that something was, the flesh and blood of a god who was slaughtered for this purpose. His name was Wi-Ila in some accounts, Kingu in others. The texts are consistent on this point across multiple independent sources, divine essence combined with earthly material to produce a new kind of being. This is the anomaly that has troubled scholars and captivated researchers for over a century. If these were simply creation myths, humanity's ancient attempt to answer the question, where do we come from? Why do they read like laboratory notes? Why specify the materials with such care? Why describe multiple attempts, some successful and some failures? Why maintain this peculiar attention to method across texts separated by centuries and different cities? The question this script explores is not whether ancient astronauts visited Earth. That dramatic claim has been made, examined, and largely dismissed by mainstream scholarship. The question we're asking is more subtle and perhaps more unsettling. What if the Sumerian accounts preserve memory of something that actually happened? Not metaphor, not theological poetry, but documentation. What if human origins involved an intervention, a directed process, an experiment in biological engineering that transformed one kind of creature into another? Before we can examine that possibility, we need to understand what these texts actually say, where they came from, and how scholars have interpreted them. We need to look at the evidence fairly, present the mainstream view honestly, and then explore what that view doesn't quite explain. This isn't about proving aliens or confirming ancient legends. This is about reading what the Sumerians actually wrote and asking why they wrote it the way they did. If you're listening to this late at night, wherever you are in the world, leave a comment about your location and the time. There's something fitting about contemplating humanity's origins in the quiet hours, when the world seems older and stranger than daylight allows. The tablet sits in its vault. The words remain pressed into clay 4 millennia ago. And the question they raise has never been fully answered. Were humans created, or did we simply evolve? Or is the truth somehow both? Before the flood. When gods walked as flesh, to understand what the Sumerian texts claim about human origins, we first need to understand who the Sumerians were and why their records matter. Sumer emerged in southern Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, sometime around 4500 BCE. By 3500 BCE, the Sumerians had developed cities, complex irrigation, monumental architecture, and most importantly for our purposes, writing. Cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, appeared in Uruk around 3200 BCE as a system for recording economic transactions. Within centuries, it evolved into a full writing system capable of capturing not just quantities of grain and numbers of sheep, but stories, prayers, legal codes, medical texts, astronomical observations, and mythological narratives. The Sumerians wrote on clay tablets, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay with reed styluses, then baking or drying the tablets to preserve them. This technology proved remarkably durable. Entire libraries have survived, buried in the ruins of ancient cities, preserving knowledge that would otherwise have been lost forever. The civilization that created these texts flourished for nearly 2,000 years before being absorbed into the Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian empires that followed. But even after Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language around 2000 BCE, it remained the language of scholarship and religion for another 2 millennia, much as Latin did in medieval Europe. Scribes in Babylon in 500 BCE still copied Sumerian texts, still studied the ancient stories, still preserved the traditions. When archaeologists began excavating Mesopotamian sites in the 19th century, they found hundreds of thousands of clay tablets. The decipherment of cuneiform, accomplished primarily through the multilingual inscriptions of Persian kings like Darius, opened a window into a civilization that had been forgotten for 2,000 years. Scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer at the University of Pennsylvania spent decades piecing together tablets, comparing fragments, reconstructing texts from multiple damaged sources. What they found challenged many assumptions about ancient history. The Sumerians had sophisticated mathematics, including a base 60 number system we still use for measuring time and angles. They had complex legal codes centuries before Hammurabi. They had literature, genuine literature with developed characters, metaphors, emotional depth, long before Homer. And they had detailed mythological texts explaining the origins of the world, the gods, and humanity itself. These mythological texts introduce us to the Anunnaki. The word Anunnaki appears throughout Sumerian and later Akkadian literature. Its etymology suggests offspring of Anu, with Anu being the supreme sky god in the Mesopotamian pantheon. But the term functions more as a designation for a group: the great gods, the senior deities, those who make decisions and shape the world. What's striking about the Anunnaki in these texts is how differently they're portrayed compared to gods in other ancient traditions. They're not abstract principles or distant cosmic forces. They have genealogies. They're born, they marry, they have children. They experience conflict, ambition, jealousy. They require food and drink. They grow tired. They argue in councils and vote on decisions. They divide responsibilities and territories among themselves. In short, they behave like beings with physical existence, not like the transcendent deities of later theological traditions. The texts describe a hierarchy among the Anunnaki. At the top sit the great gods: Anu heaven, Enlil air, authority, Enki water, wisdom, Ninhursag earth, birth. Below them are numerous lesser deities, each with specific functions, gods of cities, crafts, natural forces. And below these are the Igigi, often described as younger gods who perform labour for the Anunnaki. This hierarchical structure becomes crucial when we examine the creation of humanity, because the texts present human creation as a solution to a labour problem. The gods needed workers. The younger gods, the Igigi, were performing this labour but found it unbearable. They revolted. And in response to this revolt, the senior Anunnaki decided to create a substitute worker, a being that could take over the difficult tasks while the gods rested. The Sumerian king list, preserved most completely on the Weld Blundell prism in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, provides another crucial piece of context. This document lists the kings of Sumer from the beginning of kingship down through historical rulers. But it begins with something strange, a list of antediluvian kings, rulers who reigned before the flood. These early kings have impossibly long reigns. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. Alaljar ruled for 36,000 years. Enminluana ruled for 40,200 years. 8 kings are listed, spanning a total of 200 and 400 years. Then the text makes a simple statement: the flood swept over. After the flood, the reigns become shorter still, extraordinary by modern standards, with early post-flood kings ruling for hundreds or thousands of years, but gradually declining toward what we might consider normal human lifespans. Mainstream scholarship interprets these enormous numbers as symbolic, perhaps representing the accumulation of multiple rulers under single names, or theological statements about the golden age before the flood, when things were different, greater, longer. This interpretation has merit. Ancient peoples often used exaggerated numbers to indicate mythological time versus historical time. But the Sumerians were precise in other contexts. Their mathematical texts are accurate. Their astronomical observations were sophisticated enough to track planetary movements and predict eclipses. Their administrative records show careful accounting. Why then, when recording their own history, would they insert obvious fantasy unless they believed they were recording something real, even if incomprehensibly distant? The Sumerian worldview, recovered from these texts, presents a cosmos where the gods established order from chaos, created cities as dwelling places, and brought civilization into being not gradually, but as a gift. Kingship descended from heaven. The arts of civilization, writing, law, agriculture, metallurgy, were divine decrees or powers that belonged to the gods and were bestowed upon humanity. This is the context in which the creation stories must be understood. The Sumerians did not view their myths as made-up stories teaching moral lessons. They viewed them as preserved history, accounts of how things actually came to be. The temples maintained these texts across centuries, copying them carefully, preserving details that scribes might not have understood but faithfully recorded because they came from older sources. When we read that the Anunnaki created humanity through a specific process involving blood and clay, we're not reading the private speculation of one ancient author. We're reading a tradition maintained across multiple cities, preserved through the collapse of civilizations, translated from Sumerian into Akkadian, and still considered important enough to copy and study 1,000 years after Sumerian ceased to be spoken. The question is whether we read these texts as ancient humanity's mythological imagination at work, or as documents preserving memory of events so distant that only their outline remains, clothed now in the language of gods and creation, because no other framework could contain them. The mainstream answer is clear: mythology, theology, pre-scientific attempts to answer philosophical questions. But the alternative possibility has never been fully addressed. What if they were trying to tell us exactly what happened in the only words they had? The labor crisis in the Abzu. The most complete account of human creation appears in the Atrahasis epic, an old Babylonian text dating to approximately 1700 BCE. Multiple copies and fragments of this epic have been recovered, allowing scholars to reconstruct most of the narrative. The standard edition was published in 1969 by W. G. Lambert and A. R. Millard in their landmark work Atrahasis, the Babylonian Story of the Flood. Their translation revealed details that, earlier, more fragmentary versions had obscured. The Atrahasis begins not with humans, but with gods. In the beginning, the text explains, the gods had to work. The senior gods, the Anunnaki, imposed labor upon the junior gods, the Igigi. This labor focused on a specific location, the Abzu, or Apsu, the subterranean freshwater realm beneath the earth. Enki, god of wisdom and water, ruled over the Abzu. His temple at Eridu, the most ancient of Sumerian cities, was called E-Abzu, House of the Abzu, and archaeological excavations at Tel Abu Sharain in southern Iraq have uncovered the foundations of this structure through 18 building levels, the earliest dating to around 5400 BCE. The Igigi gods laboured in the Abzu, the text states, digging watercourses, clearing canals. The work was hard. The text is explicit about this. The drudgery was heavy, the distress too much. The Igigi carried earth in baskets. They excavated channels. They performed this work for 40 years, then 40 years more, until finally they could bear it no longer. What happens next is remarkable in its political sophistication. The Igigi don't simply complain. They organize, they hold a council, they appoint a spokesman. They decide collectively to confront Enlil, the god of authority, the overseer who imposed this labor upon them. The text describes their march to Enlil's house at night, surrounding his dwelling, calling out their grievances. Enlil becomes afraid. He sends for the other great gods, Anu and Enki. A divine council convenes to address the labor crisis. The Igigi have legitimate complaints. The texts acknowledge the work is indeed too heavy. But it needs to be done. Civilization requires these canals, this earth-moving, this infrastructure. Without it, cities cannot function, fields cannot be irrigated, the order of the world cannot be maintained. Enki proposes a solution. The text records his speech. While the birth goddess is present, let her create a primitive worker, a Lulu, to bear the yoke. Let him bear the yoke assigned by Enlil, let the man assume the drudgery of the gods. The Sumerian term Lulu means primitive or primordial. Lulu Amalu means primitive worker or primitive man. Akkadian texts use related terms, Aulu for man, but specifically Lulu when referring to the created worker meant to replace the gods. This linguistic distinction matters. The texts aren't talking about humanity in general or abstract terms. They're describing a specific category of being, defined by function, one who works. The council agrees to Enki's proposal. The birth goddess called Nintu, Ninhursag, or Mami in various texts is summoned. She is told to create this worker. But she responds with a question that lies at the heart of the entire creation mystery. How shall I create him? How will his nature be? Enki answers with procedural specificity. Let a god be slaughtered, he says. From his flesh and blood, mixed with clay, the new being will be fashioned. The text continues. Let the birth goddess mix clay with his flesh and blood. Then a god and a man will be mixed together in clay. In the future we shall hear the heartbeat. From the flesh of a god a spirit shall come into existence. The council selects We-Ila, called the god who had intelligence, to be sacrificed. He is killed. His blood is collected. Nintu mixes this blood with clay, forming the material from which the first humans will be shaped. Then she performs a ritual over this mixture, reciting incantations, completing the process of creation. The text describes what happens next in terms that sound almost clinical. Nintu pinches off 14 pieces of the clay mixture. She calls in 14 birth goddesses to help her. 7 pieces are designated male, 7 female. Each goddess takes a piece of the prepared clay, places it in her womb, and after 10 months gives birth to a human. The first generation of created humans emerges not from one woman, but from multiple divine mothers simultaneously. These humans immediately begin to work. They carried the earth baskets of the gods, the text states. The Igigi are released from their labour. The crisis is resolved. The work continues, but now it is humans, not gods, who perform it. Mainstream scholarly interpretation of this narrative focuses on its socio-political dimensions. Thorkild Jacobson, in his influential work The Treasures of Darkness, A History of Mesopotamian Religion, interprets the Atrahasis as essentially a theological justification for social hierarchy. The story explains why humans must work, because they were created for that purpose. It legitimizes the structure of Mesopotamian society, where most people labored while a priestly and royal elite mediated between humanity and the divine. This interpretation makes sense within the framework of comparative religion. Many ancient cultures developed creation myths that explained and justified their social structures. The Egyptian pharaoh was divine, therefore kingship was sacred. The Indian caste system emerged from different parts of the cosmic man, Purusha. The Greek aristocracy claimed descent from gods and heroes. But there's an element in the Atrahasis that this interpretation doesn't fully address, the procedural detail. If the story's purpose is to explain why humans must work, The simple fact that gods created humans for this purpose would suffice. We don't need to know about the blood, the clay, the specific number of birth goddesses, the 10-month gestation period. These details don't advance the theological or political purpose of the narrative. They do, however, serve another purpose. They specify a method. They describe a process as if someone actually performed it and someone else recorded how it was done. The text reads less like symbolic theology and more like documentation, a summary of how a particular result was achieved. The sacrifice of Wee-Ila is described not as a tragic or redemptive death, but as a necessary step in the procedure. He possesses intelligence. The Akkadian term suggests consciousness, awareness, the quality that distinguishes thinking beings from unconscious matter. His flesh and blood carry this quality, and when mixed with clay, the raw material of earth, they transfer it to the new beings fashioned from the mixture. This concept appears across multiple Mesopotamian creation accounts with remarkable consistency. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic preserved on 7 tablets now in the British Museum, tells a similar story in Tablet 6. After the god Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the ordered cosmos from her body, he addresses the problem of divine labour. I will create a savage, man shall be his name. I will create a savage man and let him be charged with the service of the gods, that they may have leisure. Marduk's father Ea then creates humanity using the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's consort, and the leader of her defeated army. They bound him, holding him before Ea. They imposed on him his guilt and severed his blood vessels. Out of his blood they fashioned mankind. The pattern repeats. Divine blood, earthly material, a mixing process, the creation of humans designed to work. The accounts come from different cities, different time periods, different scribal traditions. Yet they maintain this specific detail about blood being essential to the process. Not divine breath, not spoken words. Blood, the physical substance carrying the essence of the god's nature. We might ask why ancient mythmakers would invent such a detail. In most creation traditions, gods speak and things come into being. Let there be light, and light exists. The word itself has power. But the Mesopotamian accounts insist on something more material, more biological. They describe a procedure that requires ingredients, specific steps, reproductive processes. The Atrahasis continues beyond the creation sequence to describe how humans multiply and spread across the earth. Interestingly, the epic presents this population growth as eventually becoming a problem. Humans make too much noise. They disturb Enlil's rest. He decides to reduce their numbers through plague, drought, and finally a great flood. This part of the story parallels the biblical flood narrative so closely that scholars universally acknowledge Genesis borrowed from Mesopotamian sources. But our focus remains on the creation sequence itself. The procedural specificity, the biological language, the strange insistence that mixing divine blood with earthly matter produced conscious beings. The texts don't explain why this works. They simply assert that it does. And they record the process as if it were a fact of history, not a flight of theological imagination. The labour crisis in the Abzu ends with humans assuming the burden of work. The Igigi gods are freed. The Anunnaki rest, and a new species exists in the world beings, who think, who speak, who build and plant and labour, but who remain distinct from the gods who made them. Made, the texts say, from the flesh and blood of divinity itself, mixed with the clay of earth. The council's solution. A being to bear the burden. The decision to create humans, as presented in the Mesopotamian texts, did not emerge from beneficence or loneliness. The gods felt neither cosmic love nor desire for worshippers. They faced a practical crisis, their labour force had rebelled, and they needed a replacement. The solution they devised, described in the Atrahasis and echoed in other texts, involved deliberation, debate, and ultimately a decision to fashion a new category of being. When Enlil's house is surrounded by the protesting Igigi gods, his initial response is fear. The text is explicit about this. He wakes his vizier Nusku and asks what the commotion is. Nusku investigates and reports that all the gods have surrounded the house. Enlil's reaction reveals the political nature of the crisis. Let us fetch weapons and attack them. He considers a military solution. But Anu counsels otherwise. Anu, the sky god and father figure of the pantheon, suggests instead that they call Enki and hear what he advises. This moment is significant. The text presents the gods as capable of violence but choosing deliberation instead. They form a council. They discuss options. They seek wisdom from Enki, who is characterized throughout Mesopotamian literature as the clever one, the problem solver, the deity who understands hidden knowledge. Enki's response acknowledges the legitimacy of the Ijiji complaint. Their distress is excessive, he says. The work truly is too hard. But he immediately pivots to the solution. Let the birth goddess create a worker being to take on the drudgery of the gods. The Akkadian term used here, Lulum, means man, but in context specifically means the worker who will replace divine labour. The birth goddess, summoned to this council, responds with the question that becomes central to understanding what the texts are describing. She doesn't ask why such a being should be created or whether it's ethically appropriate. She asks, how? How shall I create? How will his nature be? Her question is procedural and material. She needs to know the method and the result. Enki provides both. The method requires sacrifice. A god must be killed. His flesh and blood must be mixed with clay. The birth goddess will then perform her craft using this mixture. The result will be a being that combines divine and earthly natures. Conscious like a god, physical like earth, capable of work, able to reproduce. The choice of victim is telling. The texts specify that Ila had intelligence or had Ra, Na, Yima in the Akkadian. This term indicates consciousness, discernment, understanding. The sacrificed god is not chosen at random, but specifically because he possesses the mental quality that the new beings must have. His intelligence, carried in his blood and flesh, will transfer to the created humans when the mixture is formed. This raises a question that ancient Mesopotamian theologians apparently didn't ask, but that modern readers must if gods can create. Why do they need this sacrifice? Why not simply form humans from clay alone, as Yahweh does in Genesis 2007? Why insist on the divine blood component? The texts provide no explanation for this requirement, but they insist upon it universally. Across different versions of the story, in different cities and time periods, the divine blood element remains constant. It's as if the ancient scribes were recording a procedure they didn't necessarily understand, but knew to be essential. You must include the blood of a god who has intelligence. Without it, the process doesn't work. Modern readers encountering this detail often leap to biological interpretations. Blood carries genetic information. DNA encodes the instructions for building organisms. If we were to describe genetic engineering to someone who had no concept of molecular biology, might we describe it as mixing the blood of one creature with the material of another to create something new? But we must be cautious here. The Mesopotamians had no concept of DNA. They understood blood as the carrier of life. When it leaves the body, life departs. They observed that children resemble parents, that lineages carry characteristics. They developed sophisticated animal breeding practices, so they understood heredity at a practical level. But they thought in terms of essences and substances, not molecular information. What they seem to have believed, based on these texts, is that the divine nature of the gods could be materially transferred through blood and flesh, and that when combined with earthly clay in the proper proportions, this mixture could produce conscious, intelligent beings who were neither fully divine nor merely animal. The Council's solution, then, is essentially biotechnological from their conceptual framework. They're not creating ex nihilo from nothing. They're mixing substances that already exist, following a procedure, expecting a predictable result. The birth goddess isn't speaking matter into existence through divine fiat. She's working with materials, preparing them, placing them in wombs, waiting for gestation. The term Lulu deserves additional examination. In Sumerian and Akkadian contexts, this word carries connotations of primitiveness, but also of mixed nature. Some scholars translate it as mingled one or hybrid, a being composed of multiple elements. Lulu Amalu then becomes mingled man or hybrid worker, a creature that participates in multiple categories simultaneously. This terminology suggests the Mesopotamians understood the created humans as fundamentally different from what existed before. They weren't simply formed animals granted souls, they were deliberate combinations, engineered entities, beings whose very nature reflected the twofold origin: divine essence from the sacrificed god, physical form from the clay of earth. The number of birth goddesses, 14, also warrants attention. 7 male and 7 female birth goddesses each produce one human infant. Why 14? Why not just have Nintu create all humans herself? The text seems to describe a need for multiple gestational chambers, as if one goddess couldn't produce enough offspring quickly enough. The method requires biological reproduction, not instantaneous manifestation. After 10 months of gestation, the first humans are born. The text describes them as fully formed and immediately capable. There's no infancy. They don't need to be raised or taught. They simply begin working, carrying earth baskets, digging channels, performing the labour for which they were designed. This detail contradicts human biological reality. Human infants are helpless for years. Our species requires extended childcare and education. Yet the text presents the first created humans as essentially adult upon birth. Either this is purely mythological fantasy, or it describes something different from natural human reproduction. Perhaps the modification of beings that already existed in adult form, rather than the creation of infants who then grow. The council's solution solves the immediate crisis. The Igigi are freed from labour. Humans take up the work. Order is restored. But the text hints at longer-term complications. These humans will reproduce on their own. Their population will grow. Eventually, they will become numerous enough to disturb the gods in different ways. The solution creates new problems, but those come later. For now, the experiment succeeds. The Lulu Amalu exists. The work continues. What remains unexplained is the most fundamental question. If this is mythology, why tell it this way? Why include the procedural details, the biological reproduction, the specific choice of victim, the number of goddesses? These elements don't serve the usual purposes of creation myths: establishing divine authority, explaining human purpose, justifying social hierarchy. They do, however, serve one purpose extremely well. They describe a method that could, in principle, be replicated if anyone knew how. The text read like instructions disguised as narrative, or perhaps like narrative-preserving instructions that worked once and might work again. The recipe, written in blood and clay. When scholars compare the creation narratives across different Mesopotamian texts, patterns emerge that suggest these stories were not invented independently, but drew from common source material or shared tradition. The Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, and the Sumerian Enki and Ninmah all describe human creation, and while details vary, certain elements remain remarkably consistent: divine blood, earthly matter, a mixing or combining process, and the production of beings intended for labour. The Enki and Ninmah text, preserved on tablet CBS 456-1 at the Penn Museum, provides a different perspective on the creation process. This Sumerian narrative, older than the Akkadian Atrahasis, presents creation almost as a collaborative craft project between Enki, god of wisdom, and Ninmah, a mother goddess. But the text retains the crucial element, the mixing of divine essence with earthly material. The narrative begins with Enki asleep in the Abzu, the deep waters beneath the earth. His mother Namu comes to him with a complaint: The gods are suffering under their workload. She urges Enki to rise from your bed and use his wisdom to create a substitute. Enki instructs her to pinch off clay from the top of the Abzu and states that Ninmah will help establish the creature's nature. The text then describes Enki devising a form, a shape with head, mouth in its middle, and instructing Ninmah, pour ejaculated semen into a woman's womb, and the woman will give birth to the child from that semen that you poured into the womb. This biological language, explicit and procedural, appears in a text composed around 2000 BCE. The creation process requires genetic material, semen, in this version, rather than blood, though both are bodily fluids carrying generative essence and a gestational host. What follows in Enki and Ninmah is even stranger, a creation competition. After successfully producing the first humans, Enki and Ninmah drink beer together and celebrate. Emboldened by alcohol, Ninmah declares she can create variations, beings with different characteristics. She produces 6 attempts, each with some kind of deficiency or abnormality. A barren woman, a being who cannot hold its urine, one with neither male nor female genitals, one without hands or feet, a blind being, and a trembling one. Enki examines each of these experimental creations and finds a place for them in society roles, where their particular characteristics won't prevent them from functioning. Then Enki says he will create a being for Ninmah to handle. He produces Umul, described as someone whose body is too weak to function normally. Ninmah cannot find a role for Umul and becomes frustrated. Why would a creation myth include failed experiments? Most traditions present creation as perfect divine work. When Yahweh creates in Genesis, he looks at each day's work and declares it good. When Brahma creates the castes in Hindu tradition, each emerges complete and properly ordered. But the Mesopotamian tradition includes these strange details of trial and error, of beings that don't quite work, of gods experimenting with variations. These details serve no obvious theological purpose. They don't glorify the gods. If anything, they make the deities seem less omnipotent, capable of mistakes, or at least of producing imperfect results. But they do serve one purpose. They describe what experimentation looks like. When you're developing a new process, you try variations. Some work better than others. You refine the technique until you achieve the desired outcome. The Enuma Elish provides yet another version, this time focused on Marduk's creative authority after his defeat of Tiamat. In tablet the 6th of this 7-tablet epic, Marduk announces his intention to create humans. I will establish a savage, man shall be his name. Truly I will create savage man. Let him be charged with the service of the gods, that they might have leisure. The text then records how Ea, Marduk's father, Ea being the Akkadian name for Enki, performs the actual creation. The assembly of gods identifies Kingu, who had led Tiamat's forces, as the one responsible for the war. Kingu is bound and brought before Ea. They severed his blood vessels, the text states. Out of his blood they fashioned mankind. Ea imposed the service of the gods and set the gods free. The language here is surgical. Blood vessels are severed, not just a general killing, but a specific procedure to collect blood. From this blood, humanity is fashioned. The verb used, fashioned, or created is the same used for craftwork, for the making of objects by skilled artisans. Humanity emerges from divine blood through a technical process. Across these 3 major sources, Atrahasis, Enki, and Ninmah, Elish, the pattern holds. Creation requires the sacrifice of a divine being who possesses intelligence or who led a rebellion, Ila, Kingu, or implied in the Enki version through the use of divine semen, the collection of blood or reproductive fluid from this being, the mixing of this divine material with earthly substance, clay from the Abzu, dust from the earth, a process performed by a knowledgeable deity, Enki Ea, consistently, with birth goddesses assisting. Gestation within divine wombs, producing beings after a period of time. The result being creatures capable of work but distinct from both gods and animals. This consistency across independent textual traditions is what scholars call multiple attestation. When different sources agree on details, it suggests those details were important to the tradition. They weren't added by later redactors or invented by individual authors. They were part of the core narrative that each version felt obligated to preserve. But why preserve these particular details? If we accept the mainstream interpretation that these are mythological explanations for human existence and human labour, what do the specific procedural elements add to that explanation? The theological message would be the same whether humans were spoken into existence, formed from clay alone, or emerged from cosmic eggs. The insistence on blood, mixing, gestation. These elements seem extraneous to the myth's presumed purpose. Unless the purpose wasn't theological explanation, but procedural documentation. Unless these texts preserve memory of actual events, described in the only vocabulary available to people thousands of years removed from when those events occurred. The ancient Near Eastern scholar W.G. Lambert, in his commentary on the Atrahasis, noted the unusual precision of the creation account. He observed that the text gives a remarkably detailed account of how humans were made, more detailed than required for mythological purposes. He didn't pursue this observation to radical conclusions. Mainstream scholarship doesn't, but he acknowledged the textual peculiarity. Samuel Noah Kramer, perhaps the 20th century's most influential Sumerologist, translated numerous creation texts and observed the repeated emphasis on humans as mixed beings, part divine, part earthly. He interpreted this as reflecting Mesopotamian views about human nature. We possess godlike consciousness but mortal bodies. This interpretation makes philosophical sense, but it doesn't explain why the texts describe the mixing process so specifically, as if the divine earthly combination were achieved through a physical procedure rather than abstract divine will. The recipe, then, appears in multiple versions across centuries, maintained by different scribal schools in different cities, but always including these essential elements: divine genetic material, earthly substrate, technical process, reproductive gestation. The texts preserve this pattern as if it mattered, as if the details couldn't be changed without losing something essential. We might consider an analogy. Imagine a future civilization recovering fragments of our scientific literature after a catastrophic collapse. They find multiple documents describing genetic engineering, academic papers, textbooks, lab reports. The documents use consistent terminology: DNA extraction, vector insertion, host cells, gestation or growth periods, resulting organisms. The future civilization, lacking our scientific framework, might interpret these as creation myths. But the procedural consistency across multiple independent sources might cause some scholars to wonder, what if these describe something that actually happened? The Mesopotamian creation texts, with their insistence on blood and clay, mixing and gestation, gods choosing specific victims and birth goddesses producing specific numbers of offspring, these read less like symbolic theology and more like remembered procedure. Whether that procedure involved literal genetic engineering by literal extraterrestrial beings, or something else entirely that ancient language struggled to capture, remains an open question. What's harder to dismiss is the pattern itself. Something happened that involved combining elements to produce humans, and that something was important enough to record with procedural precision across multiple independent traditions spanning more than 1,000 years. Enki's laboratory. The House of Shimti. The texts locate human creation in a specific place, the Bar Shimti, sometimes translated as House of Fate, or House where Fate is determined, but more literally rendered as House of Creation, or Creation Chamber. This location appears in multiple creation narratives, always associated with Enki and the birth goddesses, always described as the place where the actual manufacturing of humans occurred. In the Enki and Ninmah text, after Enki gives instructions for creating humans, he establishes this special location. The Sumerian text refers to it as the place where the fate was fixed. but the broader context indicates it functioned as something more specific than a mystical chamber. It was a working facility, a place equipped for the creation process. The concept of a specialized creation chamber raises immediate questions. If gods possess unlimited power, why would they need a designated location for creating life? Why not simply will humans into existence wherever convenient? The text's insistence on a specific place suggests the process required specific conditions or equipment that only this location provided. Enki's association with this chamber fits his broader characterization in Mesopotamian literature. Throughout the texts, Enki appears as the technical specialist among the gods. He's the one who knows secrets, who understands procedures, who solves problems through knowledge rather than force. He lives in the Abzu, the underground freshwater realm, which the texts sometimes describe as containing treasures and hidden wisdom. His temple at Eridu, Abzu, served as his earthly house, built over the place where the underground waters came nearest to the surface. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have revealed the extraordinary antiquity of Enki's temple. Fuad Safar and Muhammad Ali Mustafa, working for the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities in the 1940s, uncovered 18 successive temple levels at the site. The earliest, level XC8, dates to the Ubaid period around 5400 BCE, older than the pyramids by more than 2,000 years, older than Stonehenge by 3,000 years. This temple was rebuilt again and again in the same location, suggesting the spot held enduring sacred significance. The temple's design incorporated water features, channels allowing water from the natural springs to flow through the structure. The building sat at the edge of marshlands, where fresh water met salt water, where fish thrived and reeds grew thick. In Sumerian cosmology, this boundary zone, neither fully land nor fully water, held special significance as a place of creation and transformation. If we take the text seriously that human creation occurred in Enki's house at Eridu, in a chamber specially designed for this purpose, we're led to imagine a facility where the gods performed the procedures described in the myths. The Bai Shimti would have been part of the Abzu temple complex, perhaps in the underground sections associated with the Abzu waters. The text describes this chamber as the location where the clay is mixed with divine blood, where the incantations are spoken, where the birth goddesses receive the portions of prepared material for gestation. The space serves a manufacturing function. Raw materials enter, finished humans eventually emerge, with a 10-month production time required for each batch. The Enki and Ninmah text provides additional details about what happened in this creation chamber. After the initial successful creation of humans, when Enki and Ninmah begin their competition to create variant beings, they're working in the same location. Ninmah produces her 6 experimental humans there. Enki creates his problematic Umul there. The chamber apparently allowed for experimentation, for attempting variations, for seeing what results when you modify the standard procedure. These experimental beings deserve closer attention. Ninmah creates a barren woman, someone who appears fully human but cannot reproduce. She creates a being who cannot control urination, a neurological or muscular failure. She creates individuals with ambiguous genitalia, without limbs, without sight, with tremors. The text doesn't explain how she produces these variations, but it implies she's deliberately modifying something in the creation process to generate different outcomes. This sounds remarkably like experimental biology, creating variants to understand how the system works, to see what happens when specific elements are changed. It's the methodology of science. Alter variables systematically and observe results. Enki's response to each of Ninmah's creations is equally interesting. He doesn't declare them failures or abominations. Instead, he examines each one and determines what role in society might suit their particular characteristics. The barren woman can join the queen's court. The one who cannot control urination will serve a specific function in cultic ritual. The being without gender becomes a member of the royal household. Each finds a place. This suggests the gods understood these variant humans as still valuable, still part of the human category, despite their differences from the standard model. They weren't destroyed, but integrated into the social structure at positions matching their capabilities. When Enki creates Umul as his contribution to the competition, the being is described as having a broken or dysfunctional body. His heart is sick, his liver is pained, his hand cannot hold, his foot cannot step. Ninmah examines this creation and cannot find a suitable role for someone with such comprehensive disabilities. She becomes frustrated and angry, essentially declaring that Enki has won the competition by creating a being so impaired that not even her wisdom can place him appropriately. The purpose of including this strange episode in what is ostensibly a creation myth is unclear from a traditional mythological perspective. It makes the gods seem capricious, turning the profound act of creating conscious beings into a drunken game. But if we read the text as describing actual experimentation, attempts to understand what elements in the creation process controlled what characteristics, the episode makes more sense. They were testing the limits of the procedure, seeing what variations were possible, learning what aspects of the mixing process determined which outcomes. The BT Shimti then would have functioned as what we might call a laboratory, a controlled environment where specific procedures could be performed, variables tested, results observed. The birth goddesses who assisted weren't abstract fertility symbols, but something more like technical specialists, each managing one part of the gestation process, each producing one of the 14 first humans from the prepared material. The 10-month gestation period specified in the Atrahasis is itself worth noting. Human pregnancy typically lasts 9 months, though counting methods in the ancient world might have calculated differently. But the specificity of the time frame, 10 months, stated precisely, suggests the text is recording an observed duration. If humans were materializing magically from clay, why would the process take exactly 10 months? That detail makes sense only if biological reproduction was actually involved, with the divine wombs functioning as gestational chambers for developing embryos. After the initial creation and the experimental variants, the texts indicate that humans began reproducing on their own. The manufactured beings could generate offspring naturally without requiring continued divine intervention. This capability apparently wasn't automatic, it had to be built into the design. The texts mention that the created humans were given the ability to reproduce, suggesting this was a separate feature that had to be intentionally included in the creation process. The E-Abzu temple at Eridu remained the primary cult center for Enki worship throughout Mesopotamian history. Pilgrims travelled there across centuries, making offerings, seeking wisdom, consulting oracles. The city claims status as the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven, the location where order emerged from chaos. All of this fits if Eridu was indeed the site where humanity was created. The place would naturally hold profound sacred significance, would naturally be rebuilt and maintained across millennia. The temple foundations, excavated by modern archaeologists, show no obvious chambers that could be identified as creation facilities. But the earliest levels are fragmentary, and much has been lost to erosion and the passage of 5,000 years. What remains are mud brick platforms, foundation courses, fragments of walls and floors. The actual working spaces, if they existed, would have been within structures whose walls have long since dissolved back into the earth. What the texts preserve is a tradition that human creation happened in a specific place, through specific procedures, in a facility designed for that purpose. Whether we interpret this as mythological localization, the need to ground cosmic events in tangible geography, or as memory of actual events, the texts maintain remarkable consistency about where and how humanity came to be. Enki's laboratory, if it existed, would have been the most consequential scientific facility in human history, the birthplace not of a discovery, but of a species. And if the texts preserve any accurate memory of such a place, then Eridu's ancient marshes witnessed an intervention that determined everything that came after. The rise of civilization, the spread of agriculture, the development of language and art and technology. All of it stemming from a procedure performed in a creation chamber, following a recipe of blood and clay, producing beings who could think and work and eventually write down the story of their own origin. The template and the experiment. One detail in the Mesopotamian creation accounts has received less attention than it deserves. The texts suggest humans were not created from nothing, but represent modifications of something that already existed. The language is subtle, but several passages imply the gods worked with a pre-existing template rather than designing humanity from first principles. In the Enki and Ninmah text, a crucial line appears when Enki is instructing Namu about creating the worker being. He says, "The creature whose name you uttered, it exists. Make its nature known." This phrasing is strange if we're talking about creating something entirely new. How can a creature whose name is spoken already exist before it's created? The passage makes more sense if Enki is referring to something that exists already but in a different form. A creature that will be modified or upgraded rather than manufactured from raw materials. Another text fragment, preserved in various forms, contains Enki's statement about creating humans. "The one who is there, let him be attached." Scholarly translations vary on this passage because the Sumerian is ambiguous, but many interpret it as referring to an existing being who will be attached to or bound with divine essence. The implication is that something already walks the earth, a creature physically capable but lacking consciousness or intelligence, and the gods' creative act involved adding or installing something new into this existing template. This interpretation finds support in comparative analysis with other ancient traditions. The biblical account in Genesis 2007 describes God forming man from the dust of the earth and then breathing into his nostrils, the breath of life. A two-stage process where the physical form is made first and then animated or ensouled. The Mesopotamian accounts may describe something similar, a being that existed physically but required the addition of divine essence to become truly human. What creature might have served as this template? The texts don't specify, but they consistently describe humans before receiving divine enhancement as lacking intelligence or understanding. The Lulu is called primitive, not because humans are simple, but because the original template was primitive, a creature with human-like form but without human-like consciousness. Modern readers immediately think of hominid evolution. Homo erectus existed for nearly 2 million years, with brain sizes and body proportions similar to modern humans. They used tools, controlled fire, and lived in social groups. But they didn't develop complex language, didn't create art, didn't build cities. Something about their cognitive capabilities remained limited compared to Homo sapiens, which appeared suddenly in the archaeological record around 30,000 years ago and rapidly developed the behaviours we associate with human consciousness. The mainstream explanation for this transition involves gradual evolutionary changes. Larger brains, better neural organization, mutations that improved cognitive processing. This explanation works within the framework of evolutionary biology, but it leaves open questions about the timing and rapidity of the change. The archaeological evidence shows a relatively short period between anatomically modern humans and behaviorally modern humans, the famous Great Leap Forward. Around 50,000 years ago, when art, advanced tools, and evidence of symbolic thinking suddenly proliferate. The Mesopotamian texts, if they preserve any accurate tradition, might describe this transition differently, not as gradual evolution, but as deliberate intervention. An existing hominid population was modified through the addition of genetic material from the Anunnaki, producing a hybrid being with the physical capabilities of the hominid template, but the consciousness of the gods. The term Lulu Amelu takes on additional meaning in this context. If Lulu means mixed or mingled, then Lulu Amelu describes a mingled or mixed man, a being composed of two different genetic sources. The text would be telling us explicitly that humans are hybrids, combinations of terrestrial and extraterrestrial, or at least different, genetic lineages. The blood and clay mixture metaphor makes more sense in this light. Clay represents the earthly creature, the physical template. Blood represents the genetic information from the gods, the upgrade that transforms the primitive being into conscious humanity. Mix them together, allow gestation, and the result is a new category of entity. Neither purely the original creature nor purely divine, but a functional combination. The Enki and Ninmah experimental variants might then represent attempts to optimize the mixture. When you're creating hybrid organisms, you experiment with ratios. How much of each genetic source produces the best results? Too much divine essence might make the being unable to function in earthly conditions. Too little might not provide sufficient upgrade to consciousness. The standard model that eventually emerged, the humans that began reproducing naturally, represented the successful balance. The biological plausibility of such an intervention has changed dramatically over the past 50 years. When scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries studied these texts, genetic engineering was inconceivable. The idea that one species could be deliberately modified using genetic material from another was science fiction. Today, it's routine laboratory procedure. We create transgenic organisms constantly. Bacteria expressing human genes, mice with portions of human brain development genes, pigs with human-compatible organs. The technical challenges of creating a human-hominid hybrid would be enormous, far beyond our current capabilities. But the concept itself no longer violates fundamental biological principles. If a sufficiently advanced civilization wanted to upgrade a terrestrial hominid species, introducing genetic material through some kind of vector and using existing reproductive biology to produce hybrid offspring, the approach described in the Mesopotamian texts would be theoretically sound. But we must be extremely cautious here. The fact that ancient texts describe something that sounds like genetic engineering does not mean genetic engineering occurred. Ancient peoples had no concept of DNA, genes, or molecular biology. They thought in terms of essences, bloodlines, and substances. When they described mixing the blood of a god with clay, they meant something within their own conceptual framework, possibly metaphorical, possibly referring to ritual practices we don't understand, possibly describing something they witnessed but couldn't scientifically explain. The mainstream scholarly position remains that these texts are theological and mythological, not historical or scientific. They explain human nature, our mixed condition of godlike consciousness in mortal bodies through narrative. They justify social structures by linking human origins to divine intent. They answer the question, why must we work? With, because we were created for that purpose. This interpretation is intellectually responsible and consistent with how we understand ancient literature generally. We don't read Greek myths about Prometheus shaping humans from clay and assume literal truth. We recognize these as humanity's early attempts to understand existence through story. But the Mesopotamian accounts have peculiarities that even scholars acknowledge don't quite fit the standard mythological pattern. The procedural specificity, the consistency across multiple independent sources, the apparent documentation of experimental variations, the insistence that method matters, that specific ingredients and processes produce specific results. These elements suggest the texts preserve something unusual. Whether that something is actual memory of intervention or sophisticated theological reasoning about human nature or something else entirely remains unresolved. What seems clear is that the ancient Mesopotamians believed humans were created through a definite process involving the combination of divine and earthly elements, that this process was performed by beings with knowledge and capability, and that the result was a new category of conscious being designed for work but capable of eventually creating civilizations. The template and modification interpretation offers a middle ground between pure mythology and ancient astronaut theories. It suggests the texts might preserve distorted memory of something real. Perhaps not literally extraterrestrial genetic engineering, but some kind of significant change to human cognitive capabilities that ancient peoples attributed to divine intervention because they had no other framework for understanding what happened. The question ultimately becomes, when the Sumerians wrote that the Anunnaki took a primitive creature and added divine essence to create humans, were they inventing a story to explain human nature, or were they recording, in the only vocabulary they possessed, a tradition of something that actually occurred? The forbidden gift, Adapa, and the boundary. After the creation of humans, the Mesopotamian texts describe a curious epilogue, the story of Adapa, sometimes called the first man or the prototype human. Preserved on clay tablets found at Tel El Amarna in Egypt and in fragments from Assyrian libraries, the Adapa myth explores what the gods gave to humanity and what they deliberately withheld. Adapa is described as a sage of Eridu, a priest of Enki's temple, distinguished among humans for his wisdom. The text states explicitly that Enki had given him wisdom, but had not given him eternal life. This division wisdom granted, immortality withheld, becomes the central tension of the narrative. The story begins with Adapa fishing in the Persian Gulf to provide offerings for Enki's temple. The south wind overturns his boat. Angered, Adapa broke the wing of the south wind, an act that stops the wind from blowing for 7 days. This interruption of natural order draws the attention of Anu, the supreme god of heaven. Anu summons Adapa to explain his actions. Enki, Adapa's creator and patron, warns him about this summons. He instructs Adapa carefully. When you arrive in heaven, you will encounter 2 guards named Tammuz and Gizida. Show them respect, for they will speak well of you to Anu. When Anu offers you food and water, refuse them. They are the food and water of death. The narrative continues. Adapa travels to heaven, encounters the guards as predicted, gains their support, and stands before Anu. The supreme god asks why Adapa broke the south wind's wing. Adapa explains he was fishing for his master Enki when the wind capsized his boat, and he responded in anger. Anu, impressed by this human who possesses such wisdom and power, decides to offer him the gift that Enki deliberately withheld, immortality. Anu commands that the food and water of life be brought to Adapa, but Adapa, following Enki's instructions, refuses to eat or drink. He declines immortality based on his creator's advice. Anu asks why he refuses, and when Adapa explains that Enki warned him these were the food and water of death, Anu realizes what has happened. Enki has deceived you, Anu says. The food and water were indeed of life, not death. By refusing them, Adapa has lost humanity's chance for immortality. The text ends with Anu's decree. Adapa will return to Earth. He will remain the wisest of humans, but he will not escape death. And because Adapa represented humanity, all humans will share this fate, wisdom without immortality, consciousness bound within mortal flesh. This story has troubled interpreters for over a century. Why would Enki deceive Adapa? If Enki loved humanity, if he created humans and served as their patron, why would he deliberately prevent Adapa from gaining eternal life when the opportunity arose? Some scholars interpret the story as explaining death's origin, a theodicy that accounts for human mortality while absolving the gods of blame. Others see it as political, establishing the distinction between gods and humans, ensuring the mortal race doesn't threaten divine prerogatives. Thorkild Jacobson suggested Enki actually protected humanity by preventing Adapa from accepting immortality, because divine immortality might have come with divine burdens that would have been unbearable. But there's another way to read the story, one that fits with the creation narratives we've been examining. Enki deliberately engineered humans to be mortal. Immortality wasn't something humans lost through misfortune or error. It was something they were designed not to have. The wisdom was intentional. The mortality was intentional. Both served the purpose for which humans were created. If humans were indeed meant to be workers, replacing the Ijiji gods in performing necessary labour, then mortality becomes a feature, not a bug. Immortal human populations would grow without limit. They would accumulate knowledge across thousands of years of individual lifetimes. They would eventually become competitors to the gods themselves. But mortal humans, humans who live for decades rather than millennia, remain manageable. Each generation starts fresh, dependent on transmitted culture rather than personal accumulated experience. The division Enki establishes in Adapa, wisdom granted, immortality withheld, perfectly suits this purpose. Humans needed to be intelligent enough to perform complex tasks, to follow instructions, to learn and adapt. But they didn't need to live forever. In fact, immortality would have defeated the entire purpose of creating them. This interpretation casts Enki in a different light. Throughout Mesopotamian literature, Enki appears as humanity's friend, the god who warns Atrahasis about the coming flood, who provides knowledge and civilization to humanity, who advocates for human interests in divine councils. But if the Adapa story is read carefully, Enki appears as humanity's designer who built in specific limitations to ensure his creation remained controllable. The text phrasing supports this reading. Enki had given wisdom, an active decision. He had not given eternal life, another active decision. Both were choices made during the creation process. The gods didn't simply create humans and then humans randomly developed consciousness while lacking immortality. The characteristics were selected deliberately, engineered into the species. Modern genetic engineering operates on exactly this principle. When we create transgenic organisms, we select which traits to include. Bacteria engineered to produce insulin are given the genes for insulin production, but not the full complexity of pancreatic cells. Crops are given disease resistance, but sometimes with trade-offs in other characteristics. The designer chooses which features to incorporate based on the organism's intended purpose. If humans were designed genetically engineered from a hominid template with Anunnaki genetic material, the designers would have made similar choices. Intelligence, yes, because intelligent workers are more useful. Language, yes, because workers need to communicate and receive instructions. Tool use, yes, essential for performing tasks. But immortality, no, because immortal workers create long-term problems. The Adapa story, then, becomes less about one human losing immortality through deception and more about humanity as a species being created with a deliberately imposed limitation. Adapa's experience in heaven simply dramatizes this fundamental characteristic of human design. We were made to be wise, but mortal, conscious, but temporary, capable, but limited. This reading aligns with other Mesopotamian traditions about the boundaries between gods and humans. The gods possess immortality and power. Humans possess intelligence and capability, but remain mortal and weaker. This boundary is presented as fundamental and unchangeable. Heroes who seek to cross it. Gilgamesh searching for immortality. Adapa offered immortality, but refusing it all ultimately fail. The boundary holds because it's built into human nature, not enforced from outside. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the most famous Mesopotamian literary work, explores this same theme extensively. Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, closer to the gods than any other mortal. He possesses extraordinary strength and wisdom, but he cannot escape death. When his companion Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh embarks on a quest to find immortality. He travels to the ends of the earth, overcomes impossible obstacles, and finally meets Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who was granted immortality by the gods. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the story of the flood and explains that his immortality was a unique gift given under unique circumstances, never to be repeated. He offers Gilgamesh a test: stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights and prove yourself worthy of immortality. Gilgamesh immediately falls asleep and sleeps for 7 days. When he wakes, he realizes he has failed. If he cannot even resist sleep for a week, how can he hope to resist death forever? Utnapishtim's wife takes pity on Gilgamesh and reveals a secret. There exists a plant at the bottom of the sea that restores youth. Gilgamesh dives down, retrieves the plant, and begins his journey home, planning to take the plant back to Uruk and share it with the elders of his city. But while bathing in a pool, a serpent smells the plant, steals it, and eats it. The serpent sheds its skin and is renewed, while Gilgamesh is left with nothing. He returns to Uruk empty-handed, accepting finally that death is inevitable. The Epic of Gilgamesh ultimately affirms the same message as the Oedipus story: humans are mortal by nature, and this nature cannot be changed. Wisdom and achievement are possible and worthy, but death comes to all. This consistent message across multiple Mesopotamian texts suggests a deeply held cultural belief about human nature. We are not gods, we are something different, something specifically crafted to be mortal. If we accept the possibility that these texts preserve distorted memory of actual genetic modification, then the mortality limitation becomes perhaps the most important element of the engineering. The Anunnaki, having created an intelligent species, ensured that species would remain dependent and controllable by building in a lifespan limit. Humans could learn and create and build civilizations, but each individual would only live for decades. The species would develop slowly, in controlled ways, unable to match the accumulated experience of the immortal gods. This design choice, if it occurred, had profound consequences. Mortal beings require culture systems for passing knowledge from generation to generation. Without immortality, humans need writing, education, social structures that preserve and transmit information. These needs drove many of the developments that made civilization possible. Mortality shaped human psychology, making us aware of time, driving us to achieve within our limited years, creating religions and philosophies that grapple with death's inevitability. The Oedipus story presents this mortality not as a flaw or punishment, but as a condition of human existence, built in from the beginning by the same being, who gave humans wisdom. Enki's deception of Oedipus was really no deception at all. It was the inevitable unfolding of human nature encountering the boundary beyond which humans were not designed to go. Whether we read this as mythology explaining death, or as garbled memory of genetic engineering, the texts are clear. Humanity possesses consciousness and intelligence as gifts from the gods, but immortality was deliberately excluded from human nature. We were made to think, but also to die, to achieve within time but never to escape it. The boundary between human and divine holds firm, and every attempt to cross it ends in failure, because the boundary exists not in heaven but in our very genetic design. The ME, Civilization's Downloaded Instructions. Beyond creating humans themselves, the Mesopotamian texts describe a second intervention, the transfer of civilization's fundamental components from the gods to humanity. This transfer involved entities called Me, pronounced May, a Sumerian term that scholars struggle to translate adequately. Divine decrees, divine powers, cosmic principles, cultural paradigms, each captures part of the meaning, but none seems quite sufficient. The Me were not abstract ideas, but tangible things. Texts describe them as objects that could be held, transported, stolen, given, and possessed. They numbered over 100, and they encompassed everything that civilization required: kingship, priesthood, writing, music, metalworking, law, warfare, peacemaking, sexual intercourse, prostitution, truth-telling, lying, art, craftsmanship, and dozens more. Each ME represented not just the concept, but the complete knowledge and capability for that aspect of civilization. In Sumerian theology, the Me originally belonged to Enki, stored in his temple at Eridu. The myth of Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the arts of civilization, describes how Inanna, goddess of Uruk, travelled to Eridu, got Enki drunk on beer, and convinced him to give her the Me. Once she possessed them, she transported them to Uruk, and despite Enki's regret when he sobered up, the transfer was permanent. Uruk received the gifts of civilization, becoming a great city as a result. This story reveals something crucial about how the Mesopotamians understood their own civilization. They didn't view cultural development as gradual human achievement, invented slowly over generations. They viewed it as transferred knowledge, given complete from the gods. Writing wasn't developed through incremental improvements to pictographs. It was a ME that Inanna brought to Uruk. Kingship wasn't evolved through tribal leadership becoming more complex, it descended from heaven. As the Sumerian king list states, a complete package of authority and governance. This perspective might seem simply mythological, pre-scientific peoples attributing human achievement to divine sources because they lacked understanding of cultural evolution. And mainstream scholarship interprets the ME traditions exactly this way, as theological statements about civilization's sacred character, not historical claims about how civilization actually arose. But the archaeological record presents a puzzle that aligns strangely with the Mesopotamian view. Civilization appears suddenly in Sumer around 3500 BCE. Within a few centuries, fully formed cities exist with monumental architecture, complex administrative systems, long-distance trade networks, sophisticated art and writing. The transition from Neolithic villages to urban civilization happens remarkably quickly. Scholars explain this rapid development through favourable geography. The Tigris and Euphrates provided irrigation. The region lacked natural resources which encouraged trade and specialization. Population growth required new organizational forms. All these factors certainly played roles. But the speed of the transition remains striking. It's as if someone flipped a switch and civilization turned on. The concept of ME as transferable packages of complete knowledge fits oddly well with this pattern. If civilization developed gradually, we'd expect to see proto-writing slowly becoming more complex, proto-cities gradually expanding, administrative systems becoming incrementally more sophisticated. Instead, the earliest examples of these phenomena appear already highly developed. The first cuneiform texts aren't primitive attempts at writing, they're complex documents recording detailed economic transactions. The first cities aren't just big villages, they're planned urban centres with specialised districts and public architecture. The ME tradition might preserve memory of a different kind of intervention, cultural uplift. If the Anunnaki indeed created humans and wanted those humans to develop civilization, the most efficient approach would be teaching, transferring complete knowledge packages rather than waiting for humans to invent everything from scratch. This interpretation faces obvious challenges. How would such knowledge transfer work? Teaching seems too slow. Civilizing an entire species through person-to-person instruction would take generations. The texts hint at something more direct. The ME were given, possessed, incorporated. Humans who received ME didn't just learn new skills, they fundamentally gained new capabilities. Modern parallels might help us imagine what this could mean. When we talk about installing software, we mean transferring a complete functional package that immediately grants new capabilities. Before installation, your computer can't perform certain tasks. After installation, those capabilities exist fully formed. The ME tradition sounds similar. Civilization wasn't developed but installed, granted to humanity as complete functional packages. Could such a transfer happen biologically? Could genetic engineering include not just physical and cognitive characteristics, but also predispositions towards specific cultural behaviours? Contemporary research in behavioural genetics suggests certain capabilities and tendencies have genetic components. Language acquisition, for instance, appears to involve genetically determined brain structures that allow children to learn grammatical systems rapidly. Mathematical ability, musical talent, spatial reasoning all show heritable components. If human genetic modification included engineering for language capability, tool use, symbolic thinking, and social organization, these would appear to later observers as gifts from the gods, capabilities humans possessed innately rather than developing from scratch. The ME might represent ancient recognition that humans came equipped with civilization-building capabilities, not by evolution but by design. But we must remain cautious. The fact that civilization appeared relatively quickly in Mesopotamia doesn't require genetic engineering to explain. Cultural evolution operates on different timescales than biological evolution. Once certain key innovations occur, agriculture, metallurgy, writing, Subsequent developments can happen rapidly through cultural transmission and innovation. The ME tradition also served obvious political purposes. Rulers claimed legitimacy through possession of the ME of kingship. Temples maintained authority by controlling the ME of priesthood. Artists and craftsmen derived status from possessing specialized ME. The entire conceptual system reinforced social hierarchy by presenting different capabilities as gifts rather than learned skills. Yet the texts maintain peculiar insistence that ME were real objects, not metaphors. The myth describes Inanna loading ME onto her boat, physical objects being transported physically from Eridu to Uruk. Other texts mention ME being stored in temples, protected by guards, displayed during festivals. This consistent materiality suggests the Mesopotamians understood ME as referring to something tangible, even if we struggle to identify what that something was. One possibility, the ME represented actual objects containing civilizational knowledge. Written instructions, technical manuals, tool templates, architectural plans. Libraries of clay tablets preserving the accumulated knowledge of civilization would function as repositories of ME. By possessing these tablets, a city possessed the knowledge they contained, the ME of various arts and sciences. This interpretation makes the ME tradition less mysterious, but perhaps more significant. It suggests the Mesopotamians developed systems for preserving and transmitting knowledge so effective that they conceptualized this knowledge as having objective existence. Writing itself becomes a ME, not just the physical act of pressing marks into clay, but the complete system for encoding and preserving information. The Sumerian king list's phrase, "kingship descended from heaven," takes on new meaning in this context. Perhaps it refers to the moment when humans received instructions for organizing society in ways more complex than tribal leadership, complete governmental systems given as packages of knowledge rather than evolved gradually. The alternative reading, that gods literally transferred non-material powers or capabilities to humanity through some mechanism we don't understand, pushes into territory where evidence becomes scarce. We have texts claiming the transfer occurred. We have archaeological evidence of rapid civilizational development. We don't have mechanisms or explanations beyond what the texts provide. What remains clear is that the Mesopotamians themselves believed civilization came from the gods, not from human invention. They preserved traditions of specific moments when specific capabilities were granted. Writing given here, kingship established there, arts and crafts transferred in particular circumstances. Whether this represents theological explanation for cultural developments, memory of actual knowledge transfer from more advanced beings, or recognition of genetic predispositions built into the human design, the tradition shaped how Mesopotamian peoples understood their own remarkable civilization. They knew they had capabilities, writing, mathematics, architecture, law, that their ancestors lacked. They attributed these capabilities to divine gifts, transferred in the distant past, preserved through cultural tradition. The ME represented not just what civilization required, but how civilization came to be, not developed from within, but received from without, downloaded complete rather than compiled gradually through trial and error. Whether as metaphor or memory, the ME tradition presents civilization as intervention, something granted to humanity by beings who possessed it already and chose to share it for purposes of their own. Kings who reigned for millennia. The Sumerian king list, preserved most completely on the World Blundell Prism, now housed in the Ashmolean Museum, begins with an extraordinary claim. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. This opening establishes kingship as something that descends, is given, arrives from elsewhere, not something humans developed organically. The list then names the first king, Alulim of Eridu, who ruled for 28,800 years. This number demands attention. 28,800 years is not metaphorical. It's not the kind of round symbolic number often found in ancient texts. It's specific and mathematical, 83600, with 3600 being the Sumerian Sar, a significant number in their sexagesimal base 60 mathematical system. The following kings have similar extraordinary reigns. Alaujar ruled 36,000 years, Enmanluana ruled 40,200 years, and so forth. 8 antediluvian kings are listed, spanning a total of 240 years before the flood swept over and kingship had to be lowered from heaven, again, this time to Kish. After the flood, the king lists continue, but the reign lengths gradually decline. Early post-flood kings rule for thousands of years, then hundreds, then eventually reach what we might consider normal human lifespans. Mainstream scholarship treats these enormous pre-flood numbers as purely mythological, legendary times from before history proper began, not meant to be taken as actual chronology. Some scholars suggest the numbers represent accumulated reigns of multiple rulers compressed under single names. Others propose they're symbolic, expressing the golden age quality of antediluvian times when everything was greater, longer, better than the diminished post-flood world. These interpretations are reasonable. Ancient king lists often include legendary founders with impossible characteristics. The biblical genealogies in Genesis similarly include pre-flood patriarchs who lived for hundreds of years, Methuselah living 969 years, Noah 950 years. These numbers clearly aren't literal chronology in the modern sense. But the Sumerian king list differs from most legendary chronologies. In a crucial way, it transitions seamlessly from the impossible pre-flood reigns to verifiable historical rulers. The list eventually reaches kings we can confirm from multiple independent sources, rulers whose reigns are documented archaeologically, whose buildings have been excavated, whose inscriptions have been read. The list doesn't separate legendary from historical kings. It presents one continuous chronology from the beginning of kingship through documented historical periods. This creates an interpretive problem. If the early parts are pure mythology, why present them in the same documentary style as the later historical sections? The text doesn't signal to readers, now we're leaving mythology and entering history. It maintains the same format throughout: king's name, city, length of reign, transition to next king. The transition point around the flood is marked explicitly, then the flood swept over. After this statement, kingship begins again, but the reign lengths, while still extraordinary, start to decline. Etana of Kish ruled 1560 years. Several generations later, Emibaragesi of Kish ruled 900 years. This king appears in multiple independent sources and is generally considered historical. His son Aga, who ruled 625 years, appears as a character in Sumerian literature, including the poem Gilgamesh and Aga, suggesting he was remembered as an actual historical figure. The gradual decline in reign lengths from the post-flood kings down to historical norms could be read multiple ways. Symbolically, it might represent the fading of divine favour, the increasing distance from creation, the entropy of time. But it could also represent something else: the gradual normalization of human lifespan after some kind of intervention or modification that initially produced much longer lived individuals. If we take seriously the creation accounts we've examined, humans designed by the Anunnaki with specific characteristics, the king list's lifespan pattern becomes intriguing. The earliest humans directly created by the gods might have had longer lifespans. Their immediate descendants would inherit some of this longevity. But with each generation, the specific genetic modifications that produced extended lifespan might have diluted or degraded, eventually stabilizing at the natural human lifespan produced by the template species the gods had modified. This interpretation requires genetic modifications that affect aging, something we now know is theoretically possible. Contemporary research identifies genetic factors influencing longevity. Telomere length, cellular senescence, DNA repair mechanisms, metabolic efficiency, all have genetic components. If the Anunnaki possess significantly longer lifespans than the hominid species they modified, and if they introduced genetic material that influenced longevity, early human, Anunnaki hybrids might indeed have lived longer than later generations in whom the genetic modifications had diluted through successive generations of breeding within the predominantly human population. But this reading pushes hard against the evidence. No skeletal remains suggest early humans lived dramatically longer than modern ones. No archaeological evidence indicates pre-dynastic Sumerian rulers actually reigned for thousands of years. The simplest explanation remains that these numbers are mythological, representing the legendary age before history. Yet the Sumerians themselves seem to take their king list seriously as chronology. Later Mesopotamian scholars treated it as historical document, not myth collection. Scribes copied it carefully across centuries, preserving the extraordinary numbers without apparent embarrassment or need to explain them away. If these numbers were obvious fantasy to ancient audiences, why maintain them so precisely? One possibility is that the numbers preserve real information encoded in a system we don't understand. Some researchers have suggested the early king list uses different calendrical systems than later entries, perhaps counting months or seasons rather than years. Converting 28,800 years into months produces 2,400 years, still impossibly long but less absurd. Converting to seasons gives 600 years, entering the realm of biblical patriarchal ages, still extraordinary but not quite impossible. But these conversion theories require assuming the Sumerian scribes forgot to mention they were switching measurement systems partway through the document, which seems unlikely given their general precision in mathematical contexts. Another approach focuses on the mathematical patterns in the numbers themselves. The antediluvian reign lengths are all multiples of 3,600, the Sar, or 1,200. This mathematical regularity might indicate the numbers serve symbolic or ritual purposes rather than historical chronicle. They might represent sacred numerology, encoding theological concepts about the perfection of the antediluvian age through mathematically perfect reign lengths. The flood itself, the marker between the age of impossibly long reigns and the gradual decline toward historical norms, deserves attention. The king list treats the flood as an absolute boundary, a catastrophic event that separated two eras. The flood swept over, interrupts the list completely. Then, after the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The flood narrative appears across multiple Mesopotamian texts: Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, Eridu Genesis, with consistent details about a survivor who preserves humanity and receives divine favour. The story parallels the biblical Noah account so closely that common origin is certain. But the Mesopotamian versions are older, more detailed, and more explicit about the flood's purpose. The gods decided to destroy humanity because humans had become too numerous and too noisy. If the flood represents historical memory of an actual catastrophic event, perhaps the end, Ice Age flooding of the Persian Gulf region around 11,000 years ago, or some other major inundation, the king list might preserve two distinct chronological systems, pre-flood legendary chronology using different assumptions or serving different purposes, and post-flood chronology gradually conforming to historical reality as oral tradition gave way to written records. The antediluvian kings then would represent humanity's deep legendary past, events so distant they could no longer be accurately dated but important enough to preserve in the chronology. The enormous numbers might not indicate actual lifespan, but might encode information about cultural periods, astronomical cycles, or other data using numerical systems whose logic we haven't recovered. What remains undeniable is that the Sumerians believed their civilization possessed extraordinary antiquity, stretching back through the flood to a different kind of world where the rules were different, time operated differently, and beings we would call human lived alongside beings we would call gods in ways that eventually became impossible. The king list preserves this belief in documentary form, naming names, assigning numbers, tracking the descent of kingship through impossible ages down to historical times. Whether the document preserves actual chronological information distorted beyond modern recognition, or encodes other knowledge in seemingly chronological format, or simply represents legendary tradition given documentary authority. It stands as testimony to how the Mesopotamians understood their own past, impossibly deep, fundamentally different in its earliest ages, but connected through continuous tradition to the historical present. The kings who ruled for millennia represent humanity's beginning. The time when created humans, fresh from the gods' design process, first organized into civilized society under rulers whose nature partook more fully of divine characteristics than later, more purely human kings could claim. The gradual decline in reign lengths tracks the gradual fading of direct divine involvement, the increasing dominance of human biology over divine genetic contribution, until finally normal human lifespans prevail and kingship becomes a purely human institution, divine in authority, but mortal in its office holders. The mainstream interpretation, metaphor and theopolitics. Before we can fairly evaluate alternative interpretations of these texts, we must understand what mainstream scholarship actually says. The academic consensus on Mesopotamian creation myths, developed over more than a century of study by brilliant scholars working with thousands of tablets, offers sophisticated and well-reasoned explanations that account for the text without requiring extraordinary interventions. Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent his career piecing together and translating Sumerian texts at the University of Pennsylvania, established many foundational interpretations. In his landmark work, Sumerian Mythology, 1944, and later in The Sumerians, Their History, Culture, and Character, 1963, Kramer argued that these creation narratives served multiple cultural functions for the societies that preserved them. First, and most fundamentally, they answered the basic philosophical questions every culture addresses. Why do we exist? What is our purpose? What is our relationship to the divine? The Mesopotamian answer, humans were created by gods to perform labour, provides existential meaning. Human suffering and toil aren't meaningless. They fulfill the very purpose of human existence. This theological framework helps people accept the hardships of life by situating those hardships within a cosmic plan. Second, the narrated justified social structures. Thorkild Jacobson, in The Treasures of Darkness, A History of Mesopotamian Religion, 1976, emphasized the socio-political dimensions of these myths. If humans were created to serve gods, and if kings represented gods on earth, then serving kings was equivalent to fulfilling humanity's fundamental purpose. The temple system, requiring labour and offerings from the population, similarly gained legitimacy through these creation traditions. You weren't just giving your grain to priests, you were fulfilling the function for which the gods created humanity. Third, the myths explained observable realities about human nature. Humans possess intelligence and creativity, godlike qualities, but remain mortal and limited, earthly qualities. The blood and clay mixture metaphor elegantly captures this dual nature. We're not merely animals, we have consciousness, language, reason. But we're not gods either. We die, we fail, we struggle. The myth explains this condition through the mixing of divine and earthly substances, a poetic expression of humanity's intermediate status. W. G. Lambert and A.R.R. Millard, who published the definitive edition of the Atrahasis epic in 1969, carefully analysed the literary structure of these narratives. They demonstrated how the texts employed sophisticated literary techniques, parallelism, repetition, dramatic tension, character development. The creation account isn't crude primitive storytelling, it's polished literature, crafted by skilled authors working within established conventions. The labour revolt motif, for instance, serves dramatic purposes. It creates conflict that requires resolution, establishing the problem to which human creation becomes the solution. The detail about the Ijiji carrying earth baskets for 40 years builds sympathy and explains their eventual rebellion. The council debate allows different divine perspectives to be voiced, making the decision to create humans appear well considered rather than arbitrary. From this literary perspective, asking whether the blood and clay mixture describes actual biological procedures misses the point. The mixing metaphor works poetically to express dual nature, not mechanically to describe engineering processes. Readers who insist on literal interpretation are reading the wrong kind of text, like analysing Shakespeare's sonnets for historical accuracy about the Dark Lady's appearance instead of appreciating the poetry. The comparative religion approach, exemplified by scholars like Jean Botero in Religion in Ancient Mesopotamia, 2001, contextualizes these texts within the broader history of religious thought. All ancient cultures developed creation myths. These narratives show remarkable diversity in details, but commonality in function. They explain origins, establish cosmic order, define humanity's place, and validate existing social structures. Mesopotamian creation. Myths fit this universal pattern. They're not unique in claiming divine creation of humans, that's standard across cultures. They're not unique in explaining human mortality. Most traditions address this. They're not unique in connecting human existence to divine purposes. That's a central theme in religious thought generally. What makes Mesopotamian accounts distinctive is their emphasis on humans as workers, created specifically for labour. This emphasis reflects Mesopotamian social reality. Their civilization depended on intensive irrigation agriculture requiring organised labour. Their cities required constant maintenance. Canals needed dredging, walls needed repair, temples needed construction. The population's labour made civilization possible. The creation myths sacralize this labour. They transform what might be experienced as exploitation, powerful elites extracting work from common people, into cosmic necessity. You're not serving human masters who benefit from your sweat. You're fulfilling the divine purpose built into creation itself. Modern readers might find this distasteful, seeing the myths as ideological tools, legitimizing inequality. But the ancient Mesopotamians likely found comfort in these narratives. Purpose, even if that purpose involves hard work, feels better than meaninglessness. A universe where gods care enough about humanity to design us for specific function feels more ordered than a universe of random chance. The academic consensus also addresses the procedural details that seem so peculiar. The specificity about blood and clay, the number of birth goddesses, the 10-month gestation. These aren't engineering specs, but ritual elements. The texts describe not laboratory procedures, but cultic reenactments. Mesopotamian temples performed rituals that symbolically recreated creation. These ceremonies required specific actions, specific materials, specific timing. The textual instructions might document ritual procedures rather than biological ones. The Bidi Shimti, the creation chamber, might have been an actual ritual space in Enki's temple where creation ceremonies occurred. The mixing of substances might represent symbolic actions performed by priests. The birth goddesses might represent priestess figures in ritual dramas. The texts would then document religious practice rather than preserve scientific procedures. This interpretation explains why multiple texts describe similar procedures. They're all documenting the same ritual traditions performed in different cities. The consistency isn't evidence of actual events, but evidence of shared cultic practices across Mesopotamia. The extraordinary numbers in the king list receive similar treatment. Scholars note that ancient Near Eastern cultures often used large numbers symbolically. 7, 12, 60, 3000, these carry sacred significance beyond their quantitative value. The antediluvian reign lengths might encode sacred numerology rather than actual chronology. The point isn't historical accuracy, but theological statement. The antediluvian age was perfect, and perfection expresses itself through perfect, mathematically significant numbers. The mainstream position acknowledges these texts as valuable sources for understanding Mesopotamian religion, society, and thought. They reveal how the ancient Mesopotamians conceived of divinity, humanity, and the relationship between them. They preserve sophisticated theological reasoning about human nature and purpose. They document literary achievement of high order. They're important, meaningful, worthy of study. But they're not historical records of genetic engineering. They're not garbled scientific reports. They're mythology, humanity's ancient attempt to understand existence through narrative, created long before scientific method or historical critical thinking, shaped by cultural needs and theological purposes, preserved because they provided meaning and social cohesion. This interpretation is intellectually responsible, consistent with how scholars approach similar texts from other cultures, and supported by extensive evidence about how ancient literature functions. It doesn't require extraordinary claims, no aliens, no lost advanced civilizations, no impossible technologies. It situates the text within understandable human contexts, people creating stories that explain their world and give meaning to their lives. The mainstream position deserves respect. Scholars who hold it aren't closed-minded or hiding truth. They're applying rigorous methodology developed over centuries of studying ancient texts. They read ancient languages, understand ancient literary conventions, grasp cultural contexts that non-specialists miss. When they conclude these texts are mythology rather than history, they do so based on comprehensive analysis, not reflexive skepticism. Before we consider alternative interpretations, we must acknowledge that the mainstream view successfully explains these texts without requiring any extraordinary assumptions. It accounts for the evidence, makes sense of the peculiarities, and fits within our broader understanding of how ancient peoples thought and wrote. Any alternative interpretation must do better, must explain things the mainstream view struggles with, must be falsifiable rather than merely speculative, must account for the evidence more completely or elegantly. The question is whether such an alternative exists, or whether the ancient astronaut theories and genetic engineering speculations are simply modern fantasies projected onto ancient texts that were never meant to bear such readings. The procedural anomaly, when myths remember methods. The mainstream interpretation explains Mesopotamian creation narratives elegantly within the framework of mythology and theology. But certain textual elements remain difficult to account for fully through this lens. These anomalies don't prove alternative interpretations, they simply mark places where the standard reading doesn't quite fit smoothly, where questions remain open. The first anomaly is procedural specificity that serves no apparent narrative purpose. In most creation myths, the act of creation is described simply, a god speaks and humans exist. The Greek Prometheus shaped humans from clay in a single sentence. The biblical Yahweh forms Adam from dust and breathes life into him. Two actions briefly described. Norse myth has Ask and Embla created from trees, awakened by divine breath and gifts. But the Mesopotamian accounts describe a process. A god must be selected based on possessing intelligence. He must be killed. His blood must be collected. Clay must be gathered from a specific location, the top of the Abzu. The blood and clay must be mixed in proper proportions. Birth goddesses must prepare themselves. The mixture must be divided into exactly 14 portions, 7 male and 7 female. Each portion must be placed in a divine womb for 10 months. Only after this precise sequence do humans emerge. Why include all these steps? If the narrative's purpose is theological, explaining that gods created humans for labour, simply stating the gods created humans to work, would suffice. The procedural details add length and complexity without advancing the theological message. They're narratively inert. Nothing depends on knowing there were exactly 14 goddesses or that gestation took 10 months. But these details would matter intensely if the text served a different purpose, documentation. If someone needed to replicate the process, they'd need to know the specific steps, the materials required, the timing involved. The text reads less like myth explaining origins and more like technical manual documenting procedure. The second anomaly is cross-textual consistency in procedural elements despite narrative variations. The Atrahasis, Enuma Elish, and Enki and Ninmah come from different time periods, different cities, and different scribal traditions. They tell the creation story with different emphases, different gods featured prominently, different narrative frames. but they agree remarkably on procedure, divine blood plus earthly material equals humans. This mixing process is essential. No version describes creation without it. In contrast, these texts vary significantly in other details. The reason for creating humans differs. Labour crisis in Atrahasis, celebration of Marduk's victory in Enuma Elish, response to divine needs in Enki and Ninmah. The divine personalities involved shift, Enki dominant in some versions, Marduk in others, Ea in still others. The specific god sacrifice changes, Wei-Ela, Kingu, or unnamed, but the blood-clay mixture remains constant. This pattern suggests the mixing procedure was considered factual, a known element that couldn't be changed, while the narrative context could be adapted to different theological or political purposes. It's as if later authors, writing for different audiences in different periods, preserved technical details from earlier sources, even while reshaping the stories around those details. The third anomaly is the experimental variant described in Enki and Ninmah. This section of the text contributes nothing to the narrative's presumed theological purpose. Ninmah's creation of 6 deficient beings and Enki's creation of Umul don't advance any message about human purpose or divine authority. They don't explain anything about observable reality. Human populations include people with various disabilities, but this would be obvious without mythological explanation. The episode makes sense only as documenting trial and error, attempts to vary the process, to see what happens when elements change, to understand what controls which outcomes. This is experimental methodology. Alter variables systematically, observe results, refine the process. Why include this in a creation myth unless it actually happened? Why invent failed experiments that make the gods seem less competent? The fourth anomaly is terminological precision. The Sumerian and Akkadian languages use specific terms for the created humans, Lulu Amalu, mingled man, or primitive worker. This term wasn't used for humans generally, but specifically for the created beings intended to replace divine labour. Other terms existed for humans in other contexts: Awalu for citizen, Wardam for servant, Amlu for person. The use of Lulu Amalu as a special category suggests recognition that these created beings differed somehow from other humans or from what humans later became. Similarly, the term Lulu itself, primitive, mingled, mixed, carries implications that standard translation as primitive doesn't fully capture. The Sumerian texts seem to understand these created beings as fundamentally hybrid, combining elements that don't naturally combine. This linguistic precision suggests actual conceptual distinction, not just poetic variation. The fifth anomaly is the biological language. The texts describe gestation, birth, reproductive processes with matter-of-fact specificity. Divine wombs function as wombs. They hold developing beings for fixed periods and then give birth. The created humans can reproduce naturally after the initial creation, suggesting their reproductive systems were designed functional from the start. The explicit mention of ejaculated semen in the Enki and Ninmah text uses physiological terminology, not metaphor. Ancient peoples understood reproduction through observation. They knew that sexual intercourse led to pregnancy, that pregnancy took predictable time, that birth produced infants resembling parents. But most creation myths don't describe divine reproduction mechanically. Gods simply create through will or word or shaping. The Mesopotamian text's insistence on biological reproduction as the mechanism for bringing humans into existence seems oddly grounded in physical reality for supposedly mythological narrative. The sixth anomaly is the knowledge problem. If these texts are pure invention, how did their authors know to include details that align strangely with concepts discovered only millennia later? They describe mixing materials to transfer characteristics, a concept that makes no sense without some understanding that characteristics are carried by physical substances. They describe experimental variation producing different results, standard scientific methodology. They distinguish between designed characteristics, intelligence granted, and deliberate limitations, immortality withheld. sophisticated understanding that creation involves choices about which features to include. We must be cautious here. Ancient peoples were observant and intelligent. They understood heredity from animal breeding, understood mixture from daily experience with materials, understood choice from craft practice. They didn't need modern genetic knowledge to imagine that mixing divine substance with earthly matter might transfer divine properties. But the level of specificity remained striking. They didn't just say gods made humans from mixtures. They specified that the god whose substance was used must possess the trait being transferred, intelligence. They specified the proportions mattered, 7 male, 7 female portions. They specified timing, 10 months gestation. They specified replicability. Humans could subsequently reproduce the result naturally. The seventh and final anomaly is preservation itself. Why did Mesopotamian scribes maintain these texts across centuries, copying them carefully, treating them as important knowledge? If they were merely stories, entertainment, or simple theological statements, we'd expect them to evolve more dramatically over time. Myths typically change with retelling, adapting to new circumstances, incorporating new elements. But the Sumerian creation traditions show remarkable stability. Later, Akkadian versions translate and preserve Sumerian content rather than reimagining it completely. Scribes in Babylon in 500 BCE still copied texts composed in Sumer in 2000 BCE, maintaining procedural details that had no obvious relevance to Babylonian society. This suggests that texts were valued not just for narrative entertainment, but for their content. They preserved information considered important to maintain accurately. None of these anomalies individually proves the texts describe actual genetic engineering. Each can be explained within the framework of sophisticated myth-making by intelligent ancient peoples with different literary conventions than we're accustomed to. The procedural details might reflect ritual practice. The consistency might indicate shared sources or common cultural elements. The experimental variants might serve literary purposes we don't fully grasp. The terminology might preserve technical vocabulary from now lost contexts. The biological language might reflect observation of natural reproduction projected onto divine acts. The alignment with modern concepts might be coincidental or result from our over-interpreting ambiguous ancient language. The preservation might indicate theological importance rather than historical value. But collectively, these anomalies create a pattern that doesn't quite fit smoothly within standard mythological interpretation. The texts consistently behave as if they're documenting real procedures that someone performed, someone witnessed, someone recorded for posterity. Whether those procedures involved literal genetic engineering by literal extraterrestrial gods is a separate question from whether the texts present themselves as documentation rather than invention. The procedural anomaly remains. These texts read like manuals disguised as narratives, like technical specifications preserved in mythological format, like instructions for a process that worked once and might theoretically work again if anyone possessed the knowledge to interpret them correctly. This characteristic distinguishes them from most creation mythology and leaves open questions that the mainstream interpretation acknowledges but doesn't fully resolve. The blood question. Essence or information. At the centre of every Mesopotamian creation account lies blood, not clay, not divine breath, not spoken words, but specifically blood drawn from a sacrificed god. This consistency demands examination. What did ancient peoples mean by blood, and might that meaning correspond to concepts we've only recently articulated? In ancient understanding, blood was life's essence. When blood left the body, life departed. Blood pumped from the heart moved through the body and maintained existence. Observationally, this was undeniable. Wound a person severely enough for blood loss, and they died. The connection between blood and life was direct, visible, and universal. Blood also carried inheritance. Children resembled parents, and the mechanism was understood as shared blood. Blood ties meant family relationships because blood was believed to pass from parent to child, carrying lineage and characteristics. Noble blood made one noble, royal blood conveyed legitimacy. The concept of bloodlines recognized that something carried through blood connected generations and determined traits. Ancient peoples also observed that mixing blood had significance. Different tribes, different peoples had different blood. Mixing through intermarriage produced children who partook of both lineages. The blood carried something essential about group identity, about inherited characteristics, about what made different peoples distinct. When Mesopotamian texts describe mixing the blood of a god with earthly clay to create humans, they're operating within this conceptual framework. Blood carries divine essence, the qualities that make gods what they are. Clay represents earthly matter, the physical substance of the world. Mix them, and the result combines both natures, the physical body from earth, the consciousness from divine essence carried in blood. This reading is straightforward and requires no scientific knowledge beyond careful observation of reproduction and inheritance. It's poetic, philosophically sophisticated, and perfectly adequate as mythological explanation for human dual nature. But there's another way to read blood in these texts, not metaphorically but with almost eerie precision. Blood does carry information. DNA molecules in every cell contain the instructions for building organisms. Blood cells, like all cells, contain this genetic information. If someone wanted to transfer the genetic characteristics of one organism into another using cellular material, including blood, as the source would be the correct approach. The texts describe the sacrificed god's blood as the source of intelligence, the defining characteristic that separates conscious beings from unconscious matter. From a modern genetic perspective, this makes sense. Intelligence has genetic components. Brain structure, neural organization, cognitive capabilities, all influenced by genetic factors. If humans differ from other primates primarily in cognitive capability, and if that difference has genetic basis, then introducing genetic material from a more intelligent species into a less intelligent one could theoretically upgrade cognitive function. The mixing ratio matters in genetic engineering. Too little introduced genetic material and the modification might not take effect. Too much and the resulting organism might not be viable. The text's specification of exact proportions, 14 portions total, divided 7 male and 7 female, might preserve memory of optimized ratios determined through experimentation. The gestation period in divine wombs corresponds to biological reproduction timescales. Genetic modification doesn't produce instant results. Modified embryos must develop through normal developmental processes. If the Anunnaki used reproductive biology as the mechanism for producing modified humans, gestation periods would be required. The 10-month specification aligns reasonably well with human pregnancy duration. The experimental variants in Enki and Ninmah read like genetic modification gone wrong. When you alter genetic material, unexpected results occur. Some modifications affect developmental processes in ways that produce disabilities, exactly what the texts describe. Ninmah's creation of beings with various dysfunctions matches what we'd expect from imperfect genetic engineering. Some attempts work, some produce non-viable results, some create beings with specific limitations. The text's insistence that the sacrificed god must possess intelligence takes on new meaning if intelligence refers to genetic factors rather than abstract essence. You can't transfer traits the source organism doesn't possess. If the goal was creating intelligent beings, the genetic source must carry genes for intelligence. The texts recognize this with remarkable precision. The god who provides blood must have the characteristic being transferred. The distinction between traits granted and traits withheld, wisdom given, immortality denied, parallels how genetic engineering actually works. You select which genes to introduce based on what characteristics you want in the result. The Anunnaki wanted humans intelligent enough for complex work, but didn't want them immortal. In genetic engineering terms, they included genes for enhanced cognition, but not whatever genetic factors determined their own longevity. But we must be extremely careful here. This reading projects modern scientific concepts onto ancient texts that had no such concepts. The Mesopotamians didn't know about DNA, genes, or molecular biology. When they wrote about blood-carrying essence, they meant it within their own conceptual framework, not ours. The apparent correspondence between blood carries essence and blood carries genetic information might be pure coincidence. Or it might reflect that intelligent observation leads to accurate insights even without complete understanding. The ancients recognized that something physical, blood, transferred characteristics between generations. We now know the mechanism, DNA, but the basic observation physical substances carry inheritance was correct all along. The question becomes whether the Mesopotamian texts preserve accurate observation of actual events described in the only vocabulary available, or whether they represent theological imagination that happens to use blood metaphors in ways that coincidentally align with modern genetics. If we assume the former, that the texts preserve distorted memory of real genetic engineering, we must explain how ancient peoples knew to describe the process in terms that align so well with actual biotechnology. Either they witnessed something they couldn't scientifically understand but accurately observed, or the beings performing the engineering deliberately explained it in terms ancient peoples could grasp, or the alignment is less precise than it appears, and we're over-interpreting ambiguous ancient language. If we assume the latter, that these are purely mythological texts that happen to use blood symbolism, we must explain the procedural specificity, the cross-textual consistency, the experimental variance, and other anomalies we've examined. It's possible, but it requires accepting that ancient mythmakers invented details that add length without purpose and maintain those details across centuries despite their narrative irrelevance. There's a third possibility. The texts preserve something real but not literal genetic engineering by extraterrestrial gods. Perhaps they document some kind of cognitive transition, the emergence of human consciousness, the development of language, the origin of symbolic thinking. These changes, whenever and however they occurred, would have been experienced as transformative. Beings who gained these capabilities would seem fundamentally different from their ancestors. If such a transition happened relatively rapidly in evolutionary terms, and if it involved some kind of biological change that ancient traditions remembered, those traditions might describe the change using the only framework available: divine intervention, mixing of essences, blood carrying transformative power. The texts wouldn't describe literal genetic engineering, but would accurately preserve that something changed, something was added, something made humans fundamentally different from what came before. This reading maintains the possibility that the texts preserve real memory while avoiding the need for advanced extraterrestrial civilizations. It suggests the Mesopotamians were documenting human origins as they understood them, based on traditions reaching back to whenever human consciousness actually emerged. The blood question ultimately remains open. Ancient texts describe divine blood as the carrier of essence that transforms unconscious matter into conscious beings. Modern science understands blood as containing genetic information that determines characteristics. These concepts aren't identical, but they're strangely parallel. Whether that parallelism indicates ancient observation of genetic engineering, sophisticated metaphor that happens to align with biology, or humans' universal recognition that physical substances carry inheritance remains unresolved. What seems clear is that the Mesopotamian scribes believed the blood element was essential, the irreducible component without which human creation couldn't occur. They maintained this element across all versions of the story with remarkable consistency, suggesting it was considered factual, not metaphorical. Whether it was factual in the sense they believed, or in some sense we're still working to understand, the texts preserve blood as the mechanism of transformation, the carrier of intelligence, the substance that bridged the gap between earthly matter and divine consciousness to produce beings who partook of both. The experiment. Ongoing. The tablet rests in its climate-controlled vault at the Penn Museum. CBS 10673, the Nipper flood tablet, with its account of creation, antediluvian cities, and catastrophic deluge. 4,000 years separate us from the scribe who pressed those marks into wet clay. Yet the questions the text raises remain alive, unresolved, still capable of unsettling our assumptions about where we came from and what we are. We've examined the evidence. The creation accounts from Atrahasis, Enuma Elish, Enki, and Ninmah, all describing human origins through procedural mixing of divine and earthly substances. The Sumerian king, list, with its impossibly long antediluvian reigns gradually declining toward historical norms. The Adapa myth presenting mortality as deliberate design rather than cosmic accident. The Emi tradition describing civilization as transferred knowledge rather than gradual development. The B. Shimti creation chamber, Eridu's ancient temple, the archaeological evidence of sudden civilizational emergence. We've heard the mainstream interpretation, sophisticated mythology serving theological and political purposes, creation narratives explaining human nature and justifying social structures, literary achievements of high order, but not historical documents, texts demanding respect as important cultural products without requiring literal belief. And we've explored the anomalies, procedural specificity exceeding narrative necessity, cross-textual consistency in technical details, experimental variants serving no obvious mythological purpose, biological language grounded in physical processes, terminological precision distinguishing created humans as distinct category, knowledge frameworks that align strangely with concepts discovered millennia later. 3 interpretations remain possible, each with different implications. The first interpretation, pure mythology. The texts represent ancient people's imaginative answers to philosophical questions, shaped by cultural needs and transmitted through literary tradition. The procedural details reflect ritual practice or literary conventions we don't fully understand. The consistencies indicate shared cultural heritage, not historical accuracy. The anomalies result from our misreading texts from radically different cultural contexts with different assumptions about how narratives work. This interpretation requires no extraordinary claims and fits within standard academic methodology. The second interpretation encoded memory. The text preserved distorted traditions of actual events, not necessarily literal extraterrestrial genetic engineering, but something real that happened to human cognitive development. Perhaps the rapid emergence of behavioral modernity, the development of language, the transition from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, or some other transformative change in human capabilities. Ancient traditions remembered this transformation, described it in the only vocabulary available, divine intervention, mixing of essences, and preserved it because it represented actual historical truth about human origins. This interpretation takes the text seriously as containing factual information while remaining agnostic about the nature of the facts preserved. The third interpretation, documentation. The texts actually describe genetic modification of a terrestrial hominid species by advanced beings, producing modern humans as hybrid organisms combining indigenous and extraterrestrial genetic lineages. The procedural details are technical specifications. The consistency reflects accurate transmission of actual procedures. The anomalies are features, not bugs. Evidence that these texts document real events rather than invent mythological explanations. This interpretation requires accepting extraordinary claims about advanced civilizations visiting Earth in deep prehistory. Each reader must evaluate these interpretations based on their own assessment of evidence, probability, and explanatory power. The mainstream view offers the most conservative reading, requiring no extraordinary assumptions. The encoded memory interpretation takes the text's self-presentation as documentation seriously while remaining open about what exactly they document. The literal genetic engineering reading accepts the texts at face value but requires accepting scenarios mainstream science considers improbable. What cannot be dismissed is the possibility that these texts preserve something more than poetic mythology. Too many elements suggest documentation rather than invention. The ancient scribes who copied these tablets across centuries clearly considered them important enough to preserve with remarkable accuracy. They treated creation accounts as significant knowledge, not entertainment or simple theological assertion. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the interpretations. Perhaps the Mesopotamian scribes preserved traditions about human origins that contained both factual elements and mythological elaboration, transmitting across millennia a memory of transformation that actually occurred, but in ways the ancients couldn't scientifically describe. Perhaps consciousness itself, the defining human characteristic, emerged through processes that felt like divine intervention to those experiencing them, and the creation accounts document that emergence from the perspective of peoples who understood divinity differently than we do. The experiment, if it was an experiment, continues. Humans created for labour developed civilization. Beings designed to work in service of gods eventually built cities, wrote literature, developed mathematics and astronomy, created art and music, asked questions about existence and meaning. Whatever our origin, divine creation, evolutionary process, or genetic modification, we've become something more than workers. We've become questioners, seekers, creators ourselves. The Anunnaki, whether literal extraterrestrial geneticists or symbolic representations of evolutionary pressures, are absent now. The gods no longer walk visibly among humanity. The temples at Eridu lie in ruins, buried under millennia of sand. The Abzu creation chamber, if it existed, has dissolved back into earth. What remains are texts, ambiguous witnesses to origins we may never fully clarify. But the texts matter because the question matters. What are we? Created beings designed with specific characteristics for specific purposes. Evolved organisms, products of natural selection operating across millions of years. Some combination. Biological evolution, directed or modified by deliberate intervention at crucial junctures. The Mesopotamian texts offer one answer, remarkably preserved, peculiarly detailed, frustratingly ambiguous. They tell us we are Lulu Amelu, mixed beings, mingled ones, possessing consciousness from divine source and mortality from earthly nature. They tell us we were made to work but developed capabilities far beyond our original design. They tell us our origins involved processes, procedures, methods, that our existence resulted from deliberate actions, whether by gods or natural forces operating through time. Modern genetics can map the human genome, trace our lineage through mitochondrial DNA, identify the genetic factors distinguishing us from other primates. But it cannot yet explain consciousness fully, cannot yet account completely for the cognitive revolution that made humans fundamentally different from every other species on Earth. That mystery. How unconscious matter becomes conscious mind remains as profound now as when Mesopotamian scribes wrote about divine blood mixed with clay-producing beings who could think. Perhaps one day we'll develop the capability to read genetic code with such precision that we'll see evidence of modification, recognize signatures of deliberate engineering in our genome. Or perhaps we'll confirm that evolution alone accounts for human origins, that no intervention occurred, that consciousness emerged gradually through natural processes. Either discovery would answer questions 4 millennia old. Until then, the tablet rests in its vault. The cuneiform marks carry their message across time. And the mystery of human origins remains open, inviting investigation, resisting final answers, reminding us that the most important questions about existence are often the oldest questions preserved in ancient clay by peoples who looked at the same stars we see and wondered how we came to be beings capable of wonder. The Mesopotamian scribes who maintained these texts believed they were preserving truth documentation of how humanity began, procedural knowledge of our creation. Whether they were right, whether their traditions reach back to actual events or represent theological imagination, whether the Anunnaki genetic experiment describes history or mythology, each person must decide. But the texts endure, strange and specific, procedurally detailed and remarkably consistent, reading sometimes like myth and sometimes like memory, carrying across 4,000 years a tradition that humans were made, designed, created through a process involving blood and clay, intelligence and limitation, divine knowledge and earthly form. And in our bones, in our cells, in the very structure of our genetic code, might lie answers to whether those ancient traditions preserved something more than mythology. Whether we are indeed the result of an experiment begun long ago by beings we remember as gods, continuing still in every thought we think and every question we ask about what we are and why we exist. The experiment ongoing, the mystery preserved, the question waiting, patient as clay tablets, for whatever answers humanity eventually discovers about the strange and improbable origin of consciousness arising from ancient interventions or evolutionary paths described by our earliest civilizations as the deliberate work of those who came from the sky, who mixed their essence with the earth, and who created beings in their image. Mortal yet conscious, limited yet creative, earthbound yet reaching, always toward understanding the stars from which, the texts suggest, we partially descend. Listen from wherever you are. Question what you've been told. Decide for yourself. And rest, knowing that the deepest mysteries remain, patient and profound, waiting in ancient words pressed into clay by hands that believed they were recording, not stories but truth, about the most important event in human history. The moment when we became human, whether by design or chance, whether through experiment or evolution, whether created or emergent, but definitely, undeniably, irreversibly transformed into beings capable of asking why.